Levi Delaney arrived at his cousin Nathaniel's estate 2 days before the wedding. By the time the first dance ended, he had vanished without a trace. Months later, it was revealed that Nathaniel had not only killed Levi, he had cooked him, served him at the reception dinner, and watched with pride as their entire family devoured every last bite. The August sun hung heavy over the Delaney estate, a sprawling countryside villa nestled between golden fields and rows of manicured rosa bushes. It was a day meticulously planned and long awaited. Nathaniel Delaney, the last unmarried son of the Delaney family, was finally tying the knot. Guests had traveled from far and wide, some flying in from other countries just to attend the wedding of the season. The ceremony was held under a canopy of white flowers, and the reception that followed glimmered with fairy lights, vintage silverware, and curated elegance. The bride, Grace, looked radiant in her lace gown, and Nathaniel wore a custom suit stitched with his family crest. It was a scene straight out of a high society magazine, perfection crafted down to the last detail. But perfection has a strange way of drawing attention to what's out of place. As guests toasted to love and longevity, a subtle unease threaded its way through the crowd. Someone was missing. Not just anyone. Levi Delaney, Nathaniel's older cousin, the black sheep of the family but still blood, was noticeably absent. It wasn't like Levi to miss an event of this magnitude. Though not particularly social, he had confirmed his attendance weeks in advance and even posted on social media from the estate just 2 days earlier. He had arrived earlier than most, bringing a bottle of vintage wine and a modest wedding gift. Some guests recalled seeing him the first night, seated at the garden table alone, nursing his drink and scribbling in a notebook. And then, nothing. No one remembered him from the rehearsal dinner, and he was never spotted during the pre-wedding photos or even in the background of any casual selfies taken before the vows. At first, most people dismissed his absence as just another one of Levi's eccentric habits. He had always been quiet, often slipping away unnoticed at family events. But the mood shifted when Grace's mother asked about him during dinner. Nathaniel, without pause, answered that Levi must have decided not to stay. "He's unpredictable," he said, with a soft laugh, "probably wandered off to hike or think or whatever he does." That was enough to silence the questions, for the moment. Still, something lingered beneath the surface. The food arrived shortly after, stealing everyone's attention. The appetizers were elegant and light, but it was the main course that stunned the guests. A rare cut of meat, smoked to perfection, served with delicate herbs and wild mushrooms. No one could quite place the taste. It wasn't beef or lamb or pork. It was richer, darker, unfamiliar. The caterer, said to be an old friend of Nathaniel's from another village, was never seen mingling with the crowd. He had apparently delivered everything early, set up the buffet with his team, and vanished before the ceremony even started. Nathaniel praised him throughout the evening, claiming the food was part of a private culinary experiment. Guests laughed it off, too enchanted by the flavors to question it. As night fell, the dancing began. The garden lights flickered in the breeze, and laughter echoed through the courtyard. If anyone noticed that the staff were fewer than expected, or that no one had cleared the buffet table, they didn't say a word. The wine flowed. Plates were cleared. Compliments circled about how bold and exotic the meat was. One guest jokingly asked Nathaniel if he had hunted it himself. Nathaniel simply smiled. 2 days later, a gardener working near the compost pit found an old wheelbarrow tipped over in the tall grass. Inside, hidden beneath some broken flower pots and clumps of dirt, was a phone. The screen was cracked but still functional. The lock screen showed a missed call and 3 unread texts, all sent on the night of the wedding. The name on the screen was Levi Delaney. The phone was handed over to Nathaniel, who accepted it calmly, thanked the gardener, and dropped it into his coat pocket without a word. He said he'd return it to Levi when he came back. But Levi never came back, and no missing persons report was ever filed. The wedding was remembered as a beautiful event, but those who attended would later find themselves waking in the middle of the night, stomachs twisting, memories of that strange meat clawing at the back of their minds. Something was wrong, but no one could say exactly what, yet. After the wedding, life seemed to settle into a delicate stillness across the Delaney estate. Grace and Nathaniel stayed at the villa for a few more days before their planned honeymoon in Florence. The newlyweds appeared content, Nathaniel was attentive, affectionate even, and Grace carried herself with the quiet composure of someone trying to absorb the reality of her new life. Yet there was something about the estate that felt too still, almost suspended in time, like a place trying to forget something. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, watchful. Grace couldn't shake off the feeling that something had been left unfinished. Her thoughts returned constantly to Levi's absence. It bothered her more than she expected. She didn't know him well. They'd only met twice before the wedding, but she remembered how he had looked at her during the rehearsal dinner, like he wanted to say something. There was a tension in his face that now haunted her every time she walked through the halls of the estate. When she mentioned him to Nathaniel again, his response was oddly rehearsed, as though he had practiced what to say. He told her that Levi was always dramatic and probably left to avoid the social fuss. But his eyes didn't match the light tone of his voice. They were cold, calculating. One afternoon, while Nathaniel was on a video call with his solicitor, Grace wandered out toward the far side of the estate. The barn there had always intrigued her. It was older than the house, built in the 1800s, with ivy-covered walls and a slanted roof. Most of the estate's staff avoided it, claiming it was just used for storage. She hadn't been inside before. That day she found the side door slightly ajar. Curiosity pulled her in. Inside, the barn smelled of damp earth and something metallic. Sunlight pierced through the gaps in the wooden planks, illuminating dust and cobwebs. Grace stepped carefully, her shoes crunching over old hay and broken tiles. Toward the back, she discovered a second door, this one thick, locked with a rusted chain. Except the chain was not secured. It hung loosely, as though someone had recently opened it and forgotten to latch it again. Heart racing, she pulled it aside and pushed open the door. What she saw inside didn't make sense. The small room was lined with plastic sheets. A tarp lay crumpled in the corner, dark stains soaked into its folds. A heavy duty meat hook hung from a beam above, swaying gently even though there was no breeze. Against one wall stood a deep freezer, the kind used in butcher shops, humming quietly in the shadows. Beside it was a stainless steel table, its surface scratched and stained, a butcher's cleaver lying atop it. Grace couldn't tell if it was her imagination or not, but she thought she could see something lodged in the grooves of the cutting board. Something small, dark and stringy like dried tissue. She backed out of the room slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. Later that night, she brought it up to Nathaniel, trying to keep her voice light, even playful. She mentioned she had peeked inside the barn and found the odd setup. Without hesitation, he told her it was part of the catering operation. According to him, the caterer had asked for a private prep area to work in solitude. "He's an artist," Nathaniel said, half laughing. "He doesn't like people watching him work." Grace smiled and nodded, but deep down, her instincts screamed otherwise. That night she had a nightmare. In it, Levi was seated at the garden table again, the same one from the rehearsal dinner. He wasn't moving. His eyes were open but empty, his hands resting stiffly on the tablecloth. She approached him in the dream, calling his name, but he didn't answer. When she touched his shoulder, his head slowly turned, not by his own will, but as if pulled by some invisible force. Then he opened his mouth and blood poured out instead of words. She woke gasping, the sheets soaked with sweat. As she sat in the dark room beside her new husband, listening to his steady breathing, she realized that something had gone horribly wrong. The barn wasn't just a kitchen, and Levi hadn't simply left. Grace didn't have proof, not yet, but she was certain of one thing. Her new husband was lying, and Levi Delaney had never left the estate alive. The days following Grace's discovery in the barn passed in a surreal haze. On the surface, everything returned to normal. Nathaniel went about his business with mechanical ease, replying to emails, taking meetings over the phone, managing estate matters. He didn't seem concerned by Levi's absence, nor did he show any interest in following up with family or authorities. Grace, however, couldn't rest. Her mind clung to the image of the blood-stained tarp, the cleaver, and the freezer humming quietly in that windowless room like it held secrets far too heavy for a single door to contain. She began noticing small things, details that would be unremarkable in isolation, but when stitched together, began to unravel the facade of normalcy. The estate staff had been thinned. Many familiar faces from the wedding were no longer around, replaced with vague explanations. The cook who had helped serve during the reception had gone back to her village. The groundskeeper, who had been there for years, was now on a long leave. When Grace asked Nathaniel about the caterer, hoping to get a name or contact information, he waved her off with vague excuses. "He's a traveling chef," Nathaniel said. "No fixed address. Sort of an underground talent." It made no sense. She had never met a caterer who disappeared before the event ended or who asked to butcher meat in a locked barn. It wasn't until a family gathering weeks later that her suspicions intensified. Nathaniel's parents threw a small luncheon to celebrate Grace's recent pregnancy announcement. The usual inner circle attended: Nathaniel's 2 brothers, aunts, uncles, and some close friends. It was a sunny afternoon. The tables were set up under large white umbrellas and drinks flowed freely. Once again, the food was the highlight. Nathaniel personally oversaw the grilling. He had prepared cuts of meat he described as smoked venison with a proprietary glaze. Grace didn't eat. Her appetite had shriveled in recent days, but that wasn't the only reason. She watched carefully as the guests devoured the meal, offering compliments and going back for seconds. Nathaniel beamed at every praise, especially when someone said it reminded them of the wedding feast. An older uncle joked that Nathaniel must have found a secret supplier of mystery meat, and everyone laughed. Grace didn't. She sat frozen, the sound of forks scraping plates like distant thunder in her ears. She thought of the sealed packages in the freezer, the initials, the cleaver, and Levi. That night, as the guests left and the house quieted, Grace slipped away. She returned to the fire pit in the back field where the wedding bonfire had burned. It had rained several times since the ceremony, and the ground was damp, overgrown with weeds. But something about the sight called to her. She stepped cautiously into the ashes, her shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. She began to dig with her hands, pulling away charred wood and blackened soil. Less than a foot down, her fingers struck something solid. She scraped around it until a pale, curved object emerged. It was a bone. At first, she couldn't identify it. It was large, maybe from an animal she hoped. But the longer she looked, the less she could lie to herself. It was human. A femur, possibly, based on its size and shape. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She wrapped it in her scarf, carried it back to her room, and stored it in a bag beneath her wardrobe. The next morning, while Nathaniel was out handling estate paperwork, she drove 2 hours to a private forensic lab she found online. She used a fake name. The technician took the bone without asking too many questions, telling her to expect results in about a week. The wait was unbearable. Every creak in the house, every footstep behind her made her heart pound. Nathaniel had become quieter, more watchful. He had installed new locks, citing security reasons. Cameras appeared near entrances, and he started checking in on her constantly. He said he was just being protective. But she knew better. She started to feel like a prisoner in a house built on something rotten. When the results finally came, she didn't read the full report. She didn't need to. The technician only said one thing over the phone. "This bone belongs to Levi Delaney." And in that moment, Grace understood the true horror of what she had married into. Levi hadn't just been murdered. He had been disposed of in pieces, burned, fed, buried, forgotten. Except Grace would not forget. Grace stared at the wall for hours after the call. The technician's voice still echoed in her head, low and certain. "This bone belongs to Levi Delaney." The words sliced through every lingering doubt she had tried to bury. Her husband, the man she had just vowed to spend her life with, had not only killed his cousin, he had dismembered him, destroyed evidence, and served parts of him to their wedding guests. Grace wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere safe to go. She was carrying his child. She was trapped in the middle of something so dark she could barely comprehend it. But she wasn't going to stay silent. Unsure of what to do next, Grace reached out to the only person she thought might believe her. Livy's sister Elsie. They hadn't spoken in over a year, but Grace remembered Elsie had refused to come to the wedding. At the time, people said she was bitter or antisocial. Now Grace suspected something else. She called from a burner phone she bought in town, disguising her voice and meeting Elsie at a small diner an hour outside the city. She arrived early, hands trembling as she clutched the bag with the DNA results inside. When Elsie walked in, she didn't look surprised. Older than Levi by 2 years, she carried herself with sharp precision. She listened to everything Grace said without interrupting, her face unreadable. When Grace finished, Elsie pulled a worn folder from her bag and slid it across the table. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, and printed police reports. One headline stood out immediately: "Local hiker disappears in Delaney forest. Last seen near private land." Another read: "Backpack found, no body discovered." Elsie looked at Grace and spoke plainly. She believed that Levi wasn't Nathaniel's first victim. Over the past 5 years, several people had vanished near the Delaney estate, mostly transients, hikers, and people passing through. Law enforcement had never linked them together. No pattern had emerged. But Elsie had noticed something that the police had not. All of them had either stayed at or been seen near the estate shortly before vanishing. One had briefly worked at the Delaney farm during a harvest. Another had attended a local event hosted by Nathaniel's family. Another was a freelance photographer hired to capture a cousin's engagement party. None of them had been seen again. Together, Grace and Elsie compiled everything. The bone, the forensic results, the newspaper articles. Grace even photographed the room in the barn, zooming in on the blood-stained cleaver and freezer. They needed someone to listen, but not someone local. Too many people in town owed favors to the Delaneys. The family had deep roots, influence that reached into city council and even the sheriff's office. Elsie contacted a retired detective she had once worked with on a cold case. He reviewed the evidence and advised them to go hire state investigators. But they needed a legal reason to enter the property. Grace knew what to do. She took the forensic report to a lawyer under an alias and claimed she had reason to believe a homicide occurred on private land. Because she was technically a resident of the estate, she argued for a preservation order under safety concerns for herself and her unborn child. Within days, a search warrant was quietly granted. The raid happened at dawn. State police and forensics experts descended on the estate in unmarked vans. Nathaniel was caught off guard, standing in the courtyard barefoot in his robe, a coffee mug in one hand. He didn't resist, but Grace saw the moment his composure cracked. His mouth tightened. His eyes locked onto hers. There was no shock in them, only recognition. He knew she had done this. The team moved quickly. They pried open the barn, ripped up the floorboards, and broke into the freezer. What they found defied imagination. Dozens of vacuum, sealed packages neatly labeled, each with coded initials and dates. Later analysis would reveal DNA from at least 5 different victims. The freezer was full of human remains, muscle, fat, tissue, all meticulously cleaned and processed. On the wall behind the cleaver was a chart. It wasn't anatomical in the traditional sense. It was a culinary map detailing how each body part should be prepared. What temperature, which spices, ideal wine pairings. Grace watched from the main house, arms wrapped around herself. Her hands rested on her stomach, where her child grew. She couldn't understand how someone could be this calculated, this monstrous, and still smile at family dinners. Still hold her hand. Still whisper promises at night. Nathaniel was arrested on multiple charges: murder, desecration of a corpse, obstruction of justice. But the full horror had not yet been revealed. Because the authorities hadn't just found evidence of Levi, they had found others. Many others. The trial of Nathaniel Delaney quickly became one of the most sensational criminal cases the country had ever seen. It wasn't just the brutality of the murders that captivated the public. It was the grotesque intimacy of the crimes. A family heir turned predator. A wedding celebration unknowingly turned into a cannibalistic ritual. News outlets ran continuous coverage, dissecting every detail of the Delaney estate, interviewing neighbors, relatives, even former staff who had quietly left without explanation. Overnight, the estate transformed from a place of prestige to a house of horror. As the evidence mounted, the prosecution painted a chilling picture of Nathaniel's life. He was not a man who snapped. He was calculated, meticulous, and eerily composed. Experts testified that he showed no signs of traditional mental illness, but displayed traits associated with high-functioning sociopathy. In his journals, investigators uncovered entries stretching back nearly a decade. They were written in cold, clinical language, chronicling everything from victim selection to flavor profiles. Some entries even described his guests' reactions during meals, noting who went back for seconds, who complimented the texture, and who asked for recipes. It was more than murder. It was performance, control, ego. During the trial, a portion of the courtroom was dedicated to the victims' families. Many of them had lived for years not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Their disappearances had been dismissed, ignored, or buried in bureaucratic dead ends. Now, with DNA evidence and meticulous records discovered on Nathaniel's property, there was finally closure, though of the most harrowing kind. One woman fainted upon learning her missing brother's initials were written in permanent marker on a vacuum-sealed package found in the barn freezer. Grace was subpoenaed to testify. Though emotionally shattered, she sat before the court with unshaking resolve. She described her discoveries, her growing suspicions, the bones she had dug up with her own hands. The courtroom was silent as she recounted the day she realized her husband had served human flesh to their family. Her testimony was followed by that of forensic analysts, behavioral psychologists, and digital experts who confirmed Nathaniel had erased Levi's data from the guest logs and security systems. But he hadn't been as careful as he believed. One of the most disturbing revelations came from a recovered SD card found buried beneath a loose floorboard in the master bedroom closet. It contained hours of footage, some recorded from hidden cameras during family gatherings. One clip, taken during the wedding dinner, showed Nathaniel slowly circling the tables, silently watching each guest as they took their first bite of the meat dish. Frame by frame, he could be seen nodding to himself each time someone smiled or licked their lips. It was as though he fed on their unknowing approval more than the meal itself. The judge, visibly disturbed, did not allow all the footage to be shown in court. It was deemed too graphic. But it was enough. Nathaniel was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no reaction, no remorse, no plea for leniency. Just the same faint smile that had appeared in nearly every photo of him at the wedding. In the months that followed, the Delaney estate was seized by the government. It was deemed a crime scene too large to preserve in its entirety. The barn was demolished. The house was stripped and sold to cover legal fees and reparations to the victims' families. Grace disappeared from the public eye shortly after the trial, retreating to an undisclosed location under a new identity. Her child, a boy, was born healthy. She never spoke of Nathaniel again, nor did she allow his name on the birth certificate. Elsie used her share of the inheritance to build a memorial garden for the confirmed victims. It stood where the estate's rose fields once bloomed. No signs were placed, no names engraved. Only a small stone marked with a date and a line carved deep into the granite. Some feasts are never meant to be celebrated. But for the wedding guests who had unknowingly consumed Levi's flesh, the trauma lingered like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. Some turned to therapy, some to silence. A few changed their identities and disappeared entirely, unable to live with what they had unknowingly participated in. And as the years passed, whispers of the Delaney wedding still echoed through hushed conversations, a grim reminder that evil often wears the face of charm, and sometimes the most unforgettable meals come with the highest price.